Welcome to Season 2 of Our World with Norman Busigu. Now the premise of this show is quite simple. I'm going to report on and explore important topics affecting real people like you and me. Now within this there are two aims. Firstly, to have a positive social impact, and secondly, to inform. Now in this episode, I'm going to be exploring the topic of food shortages in the UK, a consequence of the coronavirus pandemic which exposed the fragile nature of the food supply chain in the UK. Now, aside from exploring some of the causes of the food shortages, I'll also be examining some of the knock-on effects. So for example, the controversy surrounding free school meals and whether these food shortages have created new challenges for certain groups in society already struggling to afford food. Stay tuned because you don't want to miss this. Now, a record 2.5 million food parcels were given to people in need by the UK's biggest food bank charity during the first year of the pandemic, as low-income families experienced historic levels of need. Now, to truly understand and appreciate just how serious this food shortage crisis was, we need to cast our minds back to the early stages of the pandemic in early 2020. In a single week in March 2020, over 1,500 local mutual aid groups were set up across the UK, with tens of thousands volunteering to support the most vulnerable in society with the provision of food, shopping and medicine. Information compiled from the Independent Food Aid Network reported a 177% increase in the number of 3-day emergency food parcels being distributed, comparing May 2019 with May 2020. But what were some of the forces that were driving this? Well, two factors bear mentioning. Now, throughout the pandemic, the emergency food aid sector struggled to cope, given a fall in donations, insufficient food supplies of certain goods in supermarkets, and also a fall in volunteers, as social distancing requirements early on in the pandemic meant that volunteers could not perform their usual functions at places such as food banks. Now, if you can remember that period of panic buying that took place, Britons purchased in excess of £1 billion of food as fears about the coronavirus spread. This led to dramatic supply chain issues, with many supermarkets experiencing serious shortages in basic food items. This would have arguably most affected households whose incomes were so low that they depended on food banks or free school meals. Having briefly examined some of the causes of the food shortage crisis, a wider problem of inadequate food distribution to those who really need it made itself visible through the saga of free school meals that played out publicly, and it's now what I'm going to briefly examine. A consequence of the national lockdowns was the decision to close schools for prolonged periods of time. This, however, raised concerns that this might increase food insecurity among families with children who relied upon free school meals. Going one step further, there were concerns that such children might be at risk of not eating as consistently or as healthily at home in the way they would at school. And it's interesting because food insecurity can have negative long-term impacts upon individuals in various ways. So for example, hindering the educational outcomes of a child or hindering the employment stability of an adult. Now, although the government early on in the pandemic promised to provide provisions to help support those on free school meals, things didn't roll out as smoothly as expected. For instance, the Food Foundation research polls found that at the end of March 2020, only 50% of adults with children received substitutes for free school meals. Again, only 50%. Now, things became more confusing and unclear after the government voted against extending the provision of free school meals through October half-term and the Christmas holidays in 2020. Footballer Marcus Rashford stepped in and heroically led a successful campaign to prevent children from going hungry until at least Easter of 2021. His widely celebrated efforts earned the support of local councils, community organisations, and a growing number of London restaurants, which stepped in where, arguably, the state had decided to step back. There's no denying that COVID-19 has intensified the food insecurity crisis in Britain, with more proportions of the population experiencing uncertainty about where and when they'll receive food regularly. But looking to the future, while supply chain issues might be resolved temporarily, Economic hardships are likely to increase as we enter into a new post-COVID world where the dividing lines between rich and poor are clearer than ever and have only deepened in some ways. The pandemic has definitely made it financially or physically harder for some to access food. For now, let's hope that the spirit of community strengthens to help ensure that we as humans look out for one another more as we all journey into what's a very uncertain chapter and future in the human experience. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Our World with Norman Busigu, and until the next time, stay safe and stay blessed.